been a long year. I think part of it was because spring break was so late, and I don't think any of us have recovered. But I really do appreciate seeing all your smiling faces. We're going to be handing out the final exam at the end of the lecture. It is due, no surprises, I don't think. It is due next Tuesday in this room. I want to remind you, and we have flyers, that we are going to have a special lecture, one that is vitally important to what we study here, and should have come first. But for lots of reasons it didn't, but we're most grateful that we are going to have the lecture. And that is that Greg Saris, who is the chairman of the Grayton Rancheria, as well as the chair of the American Multicultural Studies Department, is going to speak about what happened on this ground. He didn't kind of talk to me first before he printed his brochures and made what we now know is somewhat of an error. He's titled this speech, "The Holocaust Beneath Our Ground," and what he is referring to is the genocide of the Native Americans in Sonoma, northern Marin and Sonoma County. He is a dynamic speaker. I've sent you his readings, which I invite you to read, even if you can't do it because you have other schoolwork to do. I invite you to save it and read it perhaps over the summer, because when we start talking about genocide and we say, well, that happened over there, it happened a long time ago over there in Europe and in Africa and in Asia, we need to pull ourselves up short and remember that there was a genocide where we stand right now. Okay, you'll get your finals when we're finished. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Jeannette Ringold. She has been a speaker, has spoken widely in Northern California to groups about hidden children during the Holocaust. She is a prominent member of the Bay Area Hidden Children's Organization, and she has a very extensive academic background. I want to give you just a little bit. She has a Ph.D. in Romance Languages and Literatures from the University of California, Berkeley, and an M.A. in French from Columbia University. Those are truly impressive credentials. I don't know whether she likes to be called Dr. Ringold. No?
No, my husband is the real doctor.
Your husband is the real doctor. Okay.
He sees patients.
He sees patients. Okay. She is an experienced and talented translator and has translated any number of things that books and poetry that are published in Dutch, and she has translated them into English for English-speaking community. And we are most grateful to have her come. She's traveled a long way from the peninsula, and I would like you to join me in greeting Jeannette Ringold. There's water for you if you'd
Good.
like.
Yes, I
And
probably.
if you want to pull this down,
What is
it
that
makes
do?
it's a microphone.
Yes, I know.
But if you pull it down while it's on,
Yeah.
it makes a horrible.
I see. And I will need it. I usually don't, but I'm getting over a bad cold, so
All right. So-
unfortunately.
When you get it to the where it's good for you, just
Yeah.
flip that to
Oh,
on
okay.
in the red light.
Good.
Okay.
Let me just see. Power, right? Let me just try this. Does this work? Can you all hear me? Good. Because I'm going to try not to strain my voice.
I'm going to turn it up a little.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Myrna. and thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I mean it. I don't need to be a doctor. I leave that to others. I'm first going to, I mean, I'm here not as, you know, not because of my academic credentials. I'm really here because I was a hidden child. I lived in Holland during World War II. And so this is why I'm here, and this is why. So I'll first tell you my story, and then we can go on from there. So when one tells one story, you always have to say exactly how old you were, otherwise it makes no sense. Because people who were 20 when World War II started have a different experience than people who were 5 years old when the war started, or who were 1 year old when the war started. So it's really important to tell you everything, even though it seems silly. Anyway, I was born in December 1939 in Amsterdam, Holland. So that was before the war broke out in Holland. As you know, Poland was invaded in September of '39, and you probably know that Holland was invaded in May of 1940. So when the war started, I was 5 months old. I was the first child of my parents who had been married a year before. I come from a very large family. We've lived in Holland since, some people lived in Holland since the early 18th century, and there are even some records of the 17th century. Many of my relatives also came from Germany, but that was all well before the war. Most of my relatives lived in Amsterdam. Anyway, when I was born, I was my parents' first child. My parents remained in Amsterdam after the war broke out, and many of their relatives and friends also did. There were people who tried to leave and people who did leave. My mother was one of 5 siblings, and 3 of her siblings were already living in the U.S. No, 2, I'm sorry, 2 were living in the U.S. and one of her siblings, her older sister, was able to escape Holland the day that Rotterdam was bombed. She and her husband got on a little boat with their 2 babies, and they crossed the North Sea to England. And after that, they went to the U.S. So when the war broke out, when I was born, I should say, there were 3 of her siblings lived already in the U.S., and one of her siblings, one of her brothers, was still in Holland. And her parents, my grandparents, tried to escape in the same way that my aunt did. That is to say, get on a boat and cross the North Sea. And I hope you have an idea of the map of Europe in your head, because there's really nowhere to go when you live in Holland. If Germany invades, there is the sea, there's Belgium, and on the east side there's Germany. You don't want to go and flee to Germany, which is attacking the country. So there was nowhere to go. My grandparents tried to get on a boat to England, and they were turned back. Just the luck of the draw. They ended up in Bergen-Belsen, where they died a few months before the war ended in 1945. My father was also one of 5 siblings, and none of them went to the U.S. However, one of his only brother was able to escape to Switzerland, and and made it into Switzerland. His three sisters, however, one of them spent her time in Belgium and France during the war and survived, and the other two were in concentration camps. One of them was in Auschwitz, and they survived the war after those camps, which was pretty amazing. My father's mother, so my paternal grandfather, was living with them. But I really have no memories of my parents. In June 1942, when I was 2.5 years old, my brother was born. My parents named him Abraham Benjamin, which is a nice biblical name, not so good when the Germans are trying to kill Jews. And that name was changed later on. And during the summer of 1942, there were a lot of razzias, raids, by the Germans in Amsterdam. And things became very, very tight. And at that point, people started seriously leaving their homes, going into hiding. Many of you probably have read Anne Frank. The whole family went into hiding. Of course, you don't want to compare her and me, since after all, she didn't survive, and I did. So at the end of the summer, our parents decided to give my brother and me to the resistance. And you have to remember that I was not quite 3 yet, and my brother was not quite 3 months yet. And so it was, when you think about that, a rather extraordinary decision to give your children to strangers just to have them survive. And I don't know which resistance group took care of us, but I can go into that later. And when I was 23, in 1963, during a visit to France, I discovered more of what happened to my parents. People in general did not talk about it too much, especially not to children. You were not supposed to have understood anything of what happened to you. And of course, I understood very little during the war. So during a visit to a distant relative in France, I learned more of what happened to my parents. After giving my brother and me to the resistance organization, they fled Holland. They went through Belgium and then through France to Switzerland, which was neutral. And after all, my father's brother had managed to get into Switzerland, and so that would be a good idea. Well, my parents, unfortunately, did not have my uncle and aunt's luck. They were turned back at the border of Switzerland, and were turned back partially because they had no children with them. Irony of ironies. Of course, there might be there might be any excuse that the Swiss could have given for not letting Jews in, but you know, that was supposedly. So they were caught at the border of France and Switzerland. They were sent to Lyon, where at that point Klaus Barbie was in charge, and you may have heard of Klaus Barbie. I don't have time to go into that now. From Lyon they were sent to Drancy, which was a transit camp in Paris. And then on July 18th, 1943, they were sent to Auschwitz on a transport. And all that is documented very clearly. The Germans were masters of bookkeeping, and I have seen the list of the transport that my parents were on. And I don't really remember how many. I think there were over 500 people, or 300 to 500 people on my parents' transport, and maybe 17 people survived. So my parents were not among them. Once separated from my parents, my brother and I were taken to Deventer, which is a small town in the eastern part of Holland. Amsterdam is in the west, and Deventer is on the east, and it's a smaller town, so there were fewer Jews there, and there was a good resistance movement. And in Deventer, we were separated because it was not safe to have a brother and a sister in one family, and perhaps it wasn't even possible. My brother came to a household with older people. I thought they were old then. Maybe they weren't quite as old as I thought. But they took care of five little babies, all about his age. And they all survived the war. It was really remarkable. They were very, very poor. The top floor of their house was bombed. Never mind, they made it through the war. Oh, and one more thing about my brother. They changed his name from Abraham Benjamin to Peter. Very safe, and he still goes by that name. And I have been told that I was in 8 different households in the space of a couple of months. And of course, I don't remember that, which is just as well, because it must have been rather tough. And that was before coming to the Janssens, the people who kept me for the rest of the war. The Janssens pretended that I was their niece from Rotterdam. And Rotterdam, that was very safe because the resistance always pretended that children or anybody was from Rotterdam, because Rotterdam was bombed flat, and no one could really check if your house had been, one of the houses bombed, if the place was flat. So that was a good solution. By the way, I was blonde, very nice, very useful. Anyway, the Janssens were a young couple, recently married. I called them Aunt Marie and Uncle Theo, and they were very religious. They were Catholic. I still remember the crosses in their house. They were big crosses. As you came in, one above my bed, and there were probably others too. My family was very observant. That is to say, my parents were very observant. My mother came from a family that was not observant at all. My father came from a very observant family. So we were observant, they kept kosher. And they kept the Shabbat, and they went to synagogue regularly. My father's parents, my father's family. So when the Janssens opened a little suitcase with my clothes, there was one dress which I said, oh, it's my Shabbat dress. And of course, that dress disappeared because there was no way to let a little girl say that again, just in case I got really excited about it. And also, apparently, I talked about my father singing in the synagogue, and they also had to stop me from talking about that. Now, those are just 2 of the things that I know for sure, but you can imagine that there were lots of other things that I couldn't talk about that made it possible for me to live with the Janssens rather safely, openly, as their niece. So, at one point, I did want to go to church with the Janssens, and they let me come with them, but they never tried to convert me. That was not their goal. I remember a wonderful, at Christmas was always wonderful because they'd have a little nativity scene. Actually, it was a big nativity scene. The side of the living room was taken up by the nativity scene, and that was wonderful because of all these little dolls, And there were no toys in the ward. Once I got a doll from St. Nicholas, actually, and it was made so poorly that the head broke that very evening. I remember that very distinctly. I'm sure it was nothing I did. It was probably, bad, porcelain or something. It just didn't last. At the end of the war, I was picked up by my uncle. And that was the uncle who had remained in Amsterdam. And he was the only one who was able to pick me up at that point, because he had been in hiding for 2.5 years. He escaped from a transit camp, had been in hiding, and found me through an ad. And I didn't never realize that, but there's an Anne Frank exhibition that travels. And in that Anne Frank exhibition, there's an ad placed by Otto Frank looking for his children. And guess what? That's what they did for me. And that is how they eventually found me. But that happened after I'd had to flee with the Janssens. At the end of the war, the Janssens had been so active in the resistance that they took a German soldier, a deserter, in their home, and that was really dangerous. So at that point, they had to flee, and so we went to a farm near Deventer, and I still remember I have some memories. I really don't have many memories, as you might imagine, since I was rather young. And that is it was January 1945, which was it was an extremely cold winter. And I remember that we all got up, and then the Janssens had a baby carriage for me, and I was supposed to go in the baby carriage, and we were supposed to walk to the farm. And I categorically refused to get in the baby carriage. So I walked, hours and hours I walked, and apparently I did okay, but it would probably have been easier if I'd been in the carriage. Never mind. And at the farm, that was a new experience for me. I was a city girl, little girl. I got to feed the chickens, and I thought that was very scary, actually, because I thought they would pack me. And then I had to sleep in a bed that was in the wall, like a closet almost. And I asked them to leave the doors open just a tiny bit, because the idea of being locked up for the evening, just for the whole night, didn't suit me at all. That was not as scary, perhaps, as all the bombing that had gone on right before that, all the bombing of Deventer, because the Allies and the Germans all wanted to bomb all the bridges across the Rhine. So there was lots of bombing, and I would be carried downstairs in the middle of the night and put in the cellar in a little niche, and everything would shake, and I would be, that would be scary, but we all made it safely. And when I visited the Janssens later, that was the first thing I wanted to see. Where was that niche that I always had to be in? That really was there. So, in 1994, with the help of someone, a former member of the Dutch resistance, I was able to find one other family that had hidden me. And that was kind of interesting, because I had known about these other families, but I didn't know any details. And this was a pastor and his wife, and they had 6 children, and they took me on. And you have to realize it was brave of Uncle Theo and Anne Marie to take me, because they risked their lives. But this family risked their lives and their children's lives as well, because there was no guarantee what would happen. and this was in a small town, a very, very small town. And I would play in the sandbox, and people would come by and say, would you like to see a Jewish child? And they'd point at me. So at that point, I had to move to another family. So there were all sorts of reasons I might have to move. The others, I don't know, but I assume that it probably was hard to get food coupons for me at some points. And maybe there were problems with identity. Who knows? Maybe there were problems with the neighbors who might betray people. It's hard to tell. Aunt Marie and Uncle Theo were they were fairly savvy, and they were able to keep their neighbors, some of whom they trusted, some of whom they didn't trust. They tricked them into believing that I really was their niece, and people were willing to believe also. Remember that. Whether they actually believed or not, they were willing to suspend disbelief and save a life. After the war, when my uncle picked me up with my grandmother, that was my father's mother, we went to Amsterdam, back to Amsterdam on the train, and I lived with an uncle and aunt, actually cousin of my mother's, and then when this uncle who picked me up got married in December of 1945, then his wife, who was a survivor of Therezine, and he decided they could take my brother and me as their children, and so they started a family with 2 children, and then that year they had a 3rd child, so 3 children in 1 year was quite a bit. And we lived in Amsterdam, and until 1954, when we moved to the United States. And my uncle had wanted to go to the United States because 3 of his siblings were already there. And he had actually planned, he was going to go to the American consulate in Rotterdam the very day that Rotterdam was bombed. So that's why he was stuck in Holland, and but he was able to be in hiding rather than in a camp, so he did survive. When I came to the US, this is just a quick aside, my brother and I were not adopted because there was no such thing as adoption in Holland until 1956. There were religious reasons, there were all sorts of social reasons. It was kind of interesting, but because of that, it was going to be impossible for my brother and me to go with the rest of the family to the US. And my uncle and aunt thought that was not a good idea because we had already had difficult times, to put it mildly, and so they wanted us to come at the same time. And there was little they could do except one of our family friends approached Senator Lehman of New York, and he helped to put a private bill through Congress, which enabled my brother and me to come to the United States at the same time as the rest of the family, as though we were their real children. And then eventually we were adopted, but by then it didn't make so much difference anymore. So that is about my story, and you can ask questions later. I thought I would perhaps quickly go, I can tell you that, you know, I went to school here, obviously I got degrees here, I was married to an American. He's Jewish, from Texas, and he's the real doctor in the family. And we have 2 daughters, one of whom just got married, and the other one is also a doctor. She's a pediatrician. So, we've been living on the peninsula for a long, long time. And my brother got married to a Dutch woman and eventually went back to Holland, which is where he lives now. And he has 3 children, 3 boys. And I just saw him a month ago. He's doing fine. We danced at my daughter's wedding. Good thing. You always celebrate the good things in life. That's a big thing. I wanted to talk a little bit, because Myrna asked me to, about the hidden children. When I came out of hiding, I didn't really understand what had happened. I mean, I was 5 years old. You know, there was no way to understand that. I went to school. I was part of a family. People didn't really talk about it. It was the adults who had the awful experiences of all the concentration camps, of all the losses, of all the horrors, of, you know. And for children, it wasn't supposed to be that horrible. Of course, it was very difficult. And I didn't really figure out that I was part of a group of children, of people to whom these things had happened, until I went to a Jewish camp. And it was really a camp where you're supposed to be fattened up because nobody had enough food. And so we were all at this camp being fattened up, and I loved it. I thought it was great. I had a good time. I like to eat, and you know, there was a lot of food. You know, that was fine. And I was I bunked with, gosh, I think there were about 10 of us, 10 girls, about 8 or 9 years old. And we discovered that none of us had parents anymore. None of us. I remember that was a big shock. It was, you know, it was a weird experience, to put it mildly. I had Jewish friends at school, and we never talked about the fact that, how did you survive? I mean, you know, it had to be because you were hidden, but no one talked about it. So, for example, I had a very, very good friend, and I saw her 10 years ago, and we talked about it. We never talked, you know, at that point, we never discussed the war. We never discussed what happened. It just happened. So in 1991, a friend of mine who had also been a hidden child, and whom I had met because the people with whom she was living were not her real parents. They had rescued her, had been honored by Yad Vashem, and I met her and we talked, and she invited me to a meeting in New York of hidden children, and this was in 1991. And I remember I got a mimeographed sheet. I bet you barely know what mimeographing is, but anyway, it was not Xeroxed. It was mimeographed. And my friend Judy said, "Wouldn't this be interesting to go to?" And I said, "Nah, I don't think so. I don't think that'd be interesting at all." And she said, "Well, never mind. I'm going to go to this meeting, and I'm going to be in a room with. I'm going to share a room with 2 of my cousins." And there's 3 of us, and there's room for a 4th one. If you want to come, just join us. So I thought about it, and finally one of my friends said, "Well, if you don't go, you might regret it forever." And so I thought, okay. And finally I decided I would go. And it was very interesting because they had expected about 400 people at the most at this conference. There were 1,600 of us. And it was barely advertised because there was no internet, you know. We worked with mimeographs. 1,600 people. It was the most exciting thing. It was just amazing because I met all these people, and it wasn't that I knew anyone who had, you know, from the war, because I didn't. I was too young. But it was exciting because suddenly there were all these people who had the same kinds of experience. Nobody had the same experience. Everybody's experience is different. My brother's experience is different from mine. So nothing is the same. it depends on your age and everything. So in New York at that time, they separated us. They decided that there would be meetings of the people from various countries. So there was a meeting of the French, there was a meeting of the Belgians, and there was a meeting of the Dutch. And it was just, you know, at those country meetings, we discovered what we did have in common and what we didn't have in common. And slowly on the history started to understand what had really happened. Then in 1991, this friend of mine, Judy, she was a social worker, and she organized a group of hidden children right here in the Bay Area. She made a list, she was able to get names. She was really, really good at this. I give her full credit. And anyway, she is the one who started the Bay Area Hidden Children Group. And Hans Angers has been a member of it since its founding in 1991. And I have too. And we have been meeting ever since 1991. And children, quote unquote, from all over Europe. There are French, there's a Hungarian, there are Germans, there are some Poles, there are a whole lot of Belgians, a whole lot of Dutch. It's amazing. And we have been meeting regularly, and we're going to meet next Sunday, and it continues. We always have potluck lunch, and we've told our stories. As a matter of fact, I should have brought one of our books, or neglected, but we have told our stories, and we've put them down on paper, so we actually have a book of all our stories. That was in 91, and then our group started meeting, and then in 92 there was another meeting in Holland just for Dutch hidden children, and that was great. I went, and it was in this large building, and I went with my brother, who was living in Holland by then, and I looked at my brother and I said, all these gray-haired people, that's all of us? And it was really amazing because there were a lot of people who were hidden in Holland and by the Dutch. And if you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you'll see how many names there are of Dutch people who actually put their lives and their families' lives at risk to hide people, to save people, you know, whatever they could do. It is quite amazing. And the Janssens are on that wall too. We took care that they were honored for their work in the resistance, not just by saving me, but they also had grown-ups, adults, who they would hide and take care of, and of course the German soldier. That was in 92, and then there have been regular meetings international meetings of hidden children every year, and I don't go to them every year. That's not really necessary. It's very exciting to meet people, but you know, every year is too much. I did go to a meeting in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago. There was an international meeting there, and the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. at that time also had an exhibition of artifacts and stories of hidden children. And so we had the meeting in D.C., and people also could see their own histories. And that was quite wonderful, because there would be exhibitions, and people would be standing next to it and say, this was my story, this was me. So it was extremely moving. I took my oldest daughter along because she was living in D.C. by then, so it was very, very good. I have 15 minutes if people want to ask some questions. It's still 5, isn't it? Or around then? I mean, I could talk more. I could talk about the resistance, the students. Yeah, I would be happy to, because the students because the resistance movement, and especially the resistance movement in hiding children, was done by college students, and I think it's very appropriate to tell you about this. First of all, I want you to know, I don't know if you have this book here. It's called Saving the Children.
No.
Okay, well, I have to see if I can get you a copy. Yeah, but I have to find it. It may be hard to find it. That's the problem. It's called Saving the Children, and actually I translated it, which is neither here nor there. That's not why I'm pointing it out, because it's not terribly well written, but it's very important history of this period. It was originally a Ph.D. dissertation, and it was shortened and organized slightly better for the English-speaking market. It was a Dutch Ph.D. dissertation, and they're always very thick. There were as far I can tell you, there were four student resistance groups in Holland, and they didn't really start until 41, 42. So after the Germans had been occupying the country for a while. And it's too bad I don't have a map, because it's kind of interesting. There were universities. There was the University of Utrecht. Utrecht is a town kind of in the middle of the country. And there was the Utrecht Children's Committee, made up of students at the university. By the way, the reason students got so active in the resistance was because there was the universities and also the bureaucracy were subjected to Aryan declarations. So people had to declare that they were Aryans, not Jewish, in order to be able to keep working and to be able to keep attending the university. Well, a lot of people refused to do that, not nearly enough, but the students especially got kind of incensed about it. And so they started seeing what was going on and forming committees. So there was the Utrecht Children's Committee, there was the Amsterdam Student Group, and Amsterdam and Utrecht are kind of close together, and then there was something called NV, which means Anonymous Association. It's like an incorporation, and those were people mostly from Amsterdam, young people who were also members of, another group. And then there was something called the Trouw group. Trouw was a newspaper, a resistance newspaper, and they were quite Calvinist. Holland was very religious. People were Calvinists, or they were Dutch Reformed, or they were Catholic, and all these religions had their own niches. They had their own orphanages. They had their own labor groups. So people were quite set that way. But there was an illegal resistance paper. There was resistance, and it was illegal under the German occupation, of course. And these people, I have met some of them. And I met two women in particular in the 1991 meeting in New York. I saw two Dutch ladies, and I thought they looked really interesting. So I introduced myself, and this was at the Hidden Children meeting, and I said, "Why are you here? You don't look like you were a hidden child." And so they explained that they were being honored by the Hidden Children, and they had also been honored by Yad Vashem for their role in the resistance. So I became very good friends with these people, and they were absolutely marvelous ladies. One of them was Hetty Wouter. She was born in 1918 in Utrecht. And this is important, 1918. So by 1940, she was 22 years old. Okay. And she was part of a family that was terribly active in the resistance right from the start. I mean, these people just, they were active right from the start. And then there was another woman, Gisela Wieberdink, and she was born in 1921 in Chile. But her mother was Dutch, and they had gone back to Holland. And neither one of these two women was Jewish. So 1921, she was 19 years old when the war started. I want you to think about how old you are. And, how amazing it was. These people abandoned their studies and started working in the resistance. Gisela lived in Amsterdam, and she was going to the university in Amsterdam. And she had an apartment right across from the Gestapo headquarters in Amsterdam. So she actually saw some of the stuff that was happening, and she was particularly upset by what was happening to the children. So that's how she got involved in taking care that children could be hidden. And they figured it was easier to save children than adults because you could find another family for them. So this is really what they did. They organized themselves in all sorts of ways and would take children on the train all the way to the south of the country, all the way to the north of Holland, all the way to the east, and they would find families for them. They first started with their own families, their own circle of friends, and then it became more involved. They found ministers. They found some priests. They found people who would actually find reliable families to take in children, and that was hard because I was in 8th. That was a little more than the usual. Mostly it was 3 to 4 families that people were in. Although I know someone who was in 13 families. So but you have to remember, if we figure there were about 1,100 children who were being hidden. So that means if you have 3 or 4 families, that means you had to find 3,300 to 4,400 families. That's a lot. That's a lot of households. I mean, and then you have the support system, and you have to find, food coupons, and ration cards. They had to be forged because there was an exact count of how many people were living in households. So there was another student who I met through Gisela and Hetty, a guy whose name was Rut Matthijssen, and he actually was very instrumental. He insisted that this book be published. And he was a chemistry student, and he became really good at forging documents. So that's what he did during the war. And, if you see these people, they're just really wonderful people. There's nothing special, there's nothing heroic about them, except, of course, they were heroic. They took their own lives in their hands. And Hetty and Gisela were caught by the Germans, and they were sent to a concentration camp in Holland called Vught. And from Vught, they were sent to a camp for women called Ravensbrück. And that was a pretty bad camp. They managed to survive it together. They were in cells next to each other, and they knocked on the cell walls, and they somehow managed to communicate. And they also wrote very, very, very tiny letters to each other and managed to smuggle those. But they survived. They survived interrogations. They survived all sorts of things. But they were extraordinarily heroic. There were also Jews who were in the resistance. And in Amsterdam, there was a theater, the Schouwburg, the Hollandse Schouwburg, which was then made into a Jewish theater because, you had to keep Jews and everyone else separated. And Jews would be sent there after they had been picked up in their homes and before they were sent on to concentration camps. And so it was a gathering spot. And there were a lot of families there, and the conditions were unsanitary, horrible. And for families with small children, that was a particular problem. So they organized a creche, a place where the children could be taken care of, especially the small ones. And that was across the street. Was it across the street? Or was it next? Yeah, across the street, thank you. Across the street from the Schouwburg. And so they were all Jewish children who were taken care of, their small ones. And they were taken care of by Jewish nurses, by Jewish social workers. And they organized themselves so that they could smuggle children out. So they did a fair amount of smuggling. They would take the children on walks at a certain point and somehow managed to lose a child on one of those walks, but that was very carefully orchestrated. They also, it was across the street from the Schouwburg, from where the parents were, and there was a tram that ran on that street. So sometimes they were able to escape when the tram was going, and they could escape strategically. And some little children were actually carried off in baskets to safe homes. So there were student groups. There was the group of the newspaper, the Calvinist newspaper Trouw, and there were the Jewish resistance worker. So those were the people who were really active, and they were all really young. And I think that that's something that is worth remembering, because it was remarkable. And these people remained remarkable throughout their lives. They did wonderful things then, and they led very good lives afterwards. They did not perhaps become prime minister, but they led fantastic lives. So I think that I will leave it at this, and perhaps people have some questions. Oh, yes.
The book Saving the Children, who's the author of the book?
The author is, his last name is Flim, F-L-I-M, and his first name is Bert Jan, B-E-R-T-J-A-N. So it's called Saving the Children, History of the Organized Effort to Rescue Jewish Children in the Netherlands, 1942-1945. So, that's it? Yes?
Did you ever reunited with the Youngsons, like later? Did you get to see them?
Yes, I did. It took a while because my uncle and aunt weren't so sure that they wanted the contact to be too close, because they were actually afraid that the Youngsons might want to keep me, and there was some cause for that fear, because it had been very hard to find me. There was the article there was the thing in the newspaper, the ad, and the Janssens had not responded to it. And so one of the other families, the minister family, pointed the Janssens out to my uncle. So there was a worry that they might want to keep me. So there was resentment, and that was very unfortunate. But I did get together with the Janssens, and it was wonderful. They had one daughter of their own after the war. Her name is Marga, and actually I'm in touch with her. And my husband and I took our daughters to see the Janssens, and it was great, because I had totally forgotten about that until my daughter mentioned it, and that is they prayed before and after the meal. They were that religious, but the Janssens thought, when we visited them, that we would be religious too. So everybody was sitting there waiting for us to do something. And it turns out, no, we're not religious, we're not observant. So they were waiting for us to pray and before our meal, and we didn't. And my daughter remembered that, and that was kind of funny. But the Janssens had, I think, something like 8 different kinds of bread. I mean, this is still remembered in our family as very, very memorable, a very memorable lunch. And then after they died, the Janssens, then we visited their daughter and her family. So we've stayed in touch. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you know how many of the hidden children were taken in by the families that hid them afterwards?
There are no good numbers, no. And it was very, very complicated in Holland especially. There were out of 107,000 Jews who were deported, there were, out of 107,000 Jews who were deported from Holland, 5,500 returned. So obviously there were a lot of orphans. And there were orphanages for Jews, for Jewish children, and then there were conflicts between the families that wanted the children back, even if they were no longer intact families, if it was just a father or just a mother, and the family that had kept them. So there were some really difficult conflicts, some of which were never resolved very well, and that was not easy. And of course, people who have been in concentration camps might not necessarily make the best of parents. It may be very difficult, and dealing with all the losses. So there were conflicts in many different directions. But a lot of the kids were returned to their families. But my uncle picked me up right away because he was worried that there might be a chance that I would be kept, because my parents were gone and he was not married, so he was not considered suitable as a parent. Yes?
Did your uncle have any family portraits or any family pictures that were saved in any way that you could see with your mom and dad replying?
Yes, I do have photos, not very many, but I do have photos. There's a wonderful photo of my parents at their wedding, really a wonderful, wonderful photo. And then there are some photos from when they were younger, but they're tiny, tiny little snapshots, so you can barely see anything on them. And there's some things that, there's some things that were saved. I'm wearing my mother's watch. It was saved. What do you do with a watch? I guess you wear it. So, but there are some really nice photos. Not too many. Any other questions? Yes?
I'd be very curious about what it was like as a child having this kind of unusually blended family of your uncle, his wife who was a camp survivor, your brother, and your cousin that you were living with.
Yeah.
and how that might have been different for you when you came to the States and were you reunited with a slightly larger family of relatives.
Yeah, that's not exactly true. I probably misstated things a little bit because it's so complicated. One of my daughters used to say, well, Mommy has to tell her story to Daddy every night because otherwise he can't figure out how the family is structured. It's very complicated. Right after the war, I was with the cousins, with my mother's cousins, who had a son my age. And he had also been in hiding, and of course they were really happy to see him. And I was kind of a fifth wheel. I really, I wasn't too important in the scheme of things, so I knew that was difficult. Not only that, my cousin and I have not gotten over it ever. He and I still, remember how hard that was and how unpleasant. But then I was taken in by my uncle and his new wife. So that was another. I've just had a lot of different family situations. But then my uncle and his wife went to the U.S., so I went with them. So, and when you say more relatives in the U.S., that's true, except I have a lot of relatives in Holland too. They're all second cousins or third cousins, whatever. But we're all fairly close because of the horrible things that happened in the war. So that wasn't as hard as coming to the U.S. as a teenager, 14, and coming to an American high school and not, just having no idea of what I was running into. It was unpleasant. It was not a good thing. Coming to the U.S. in 1954, when people really weren't paying attention to the rest of the world the way they are now. So that was hard, yeah.
Did you have a systematic way that you went about telling your own children about your experience?
No, it was not systematic. What it was they always knew. I asked my older daughter, I said, Dina, when did you know that I was a hidden child? She says, well, Mommy, I always knew. And essentially, that was true. She always knew. She always knew that I was not, that I was adopted, that I was not a real, a birth child of the people with whom I was living, who had adopted me. They were definitely my uncle and aunt, even though for the law I was their child. So they always knew. No, it was not systematic. It was just, they knew, and it's better that way. I think it worked. Any other questions? Oh, okay. I guess you know everything.
Will you join me in thanking Jeannette?